Greetings, viewers. Today, in this exciting edition of GeoInterview, we have with us Mr. Amos Fox. He is a lieutenant colonel in the US Army and currently a PhD candidate at the University of Reading. Further, he is also Chief Human Resource Officer at the Irregular Warfare Initiative. He actively writes about the domains of land and irregular warfare. He's also the host of this wonderful Revolution in Military Affairs podcast, which explores military innovation and modern warfare's evolution. His analysis is widely read by researchers across the globe. It's an honor for us to have you here, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I appreciate the kind introduction. And I guess before we get going real fast, just one note that I am, for just a bare bit longer, a tiny bit longer, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. I'm retiring in about 2 weeks, so everything that I say is my own opinion and my own thoughts and views, not the U.S. government or the Department of the Army. So just want to make that clear. But otherwise, thank you again. Probably overly generous introduction there, but I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Uh, so I'll start with a question. Land warfare. What are the basic characteristic of land warfare in military context, and how do you see the evolution of land warfare vis-a-vis the current phase of technological advancements?
Say the beginning part of that question one more time.
What are the basic characteristics of the land warfare in military context, and how do you see the evolution of land warfare vis-a-vis the phase of technological advancements?
Yeah, so I think basically land warfare is, and I don't say this in any kind of pejorative way, but land warfare has some enduring characteristics that exist beyond beyond just what they are today. And so some of those things that we have to consider are the fact that geography is geography. Geography may change slightly, just due to the course of erosion or man-made things that cause geography to change, the physical environment, but you can't separate land warfare from the physical environment. And Robert Kaplan, in his book, The Revenge of Geography, essentially says something to that effect that, we found out, we being, the US of the West, Western military is the West in general, found out that geography still matters. Is it, stopped us from doing things that looked good, perhaps in a conference room that didn't play out that way in reality in the post 9/11 period. And so I think that really is like the starting point for understanding land warfare. Is you have to understand that land is the predominant thing that you have to factor in there, and then from there you can deviate off of off of that and begin to look at other aspects of land warfare. And so you can't, and I say that to say, like, you can't wish your way over a river, or you can't wish your way over a lake. You have to have uh, the physical capabilities within a military to overcome those physical and geographic constraints. And so there's that. It's the same thing too with, again, with mountains or hills or whatever the case may be. You can't wish your way over a hill. You can't wish your way through a mountain pass. You have to have realistic ways of getting through that. Same thing too with distance, right? Distance is something that you can't um, just not account for, right? And so when you look at Russia, Ukraine, the distances that are at play there are distances operationally that we haven't dealt with. I say that people that think about military problems, we haven't had to deal with, in decades as it relates to war, just because that physical battle space is so much larger than so many places that we've had to think about before. And so that comes with a whole host of logistical considerations that we often don't think about in other contexts, right? And so the logistical problems that Russian and Ukrainian forces are having to deal with today is part of the reason that the conflict is, I think, stagnated to a degree on that front that's developed there, because it is logistically challenging to continue to keep going. And that gets into that whole idea of, Clausewitz's idea of the culmination, right? And the culmination point. And there's a difference between culminating and culmination. And I think the culmination aspect of that is, big picture, your army is no longer able to keep fighting, period. And so the war is essentially for you over. Whereas culmination or culminating is something that you can do iteratively as as you've run out of steam on a specific thing. And so those are some of the big things that I think are vitally important to understanding as it pertains to land warfare. The other thing that I think the last thing here on that, and then I'll ask you to say the second part of your question again, because I think I'm not drifting, but rambling, not even rambling, just talking a little long on the first part of your question here. But the second part of that is that, again, land forces, in land warfare, there are certain things you have to do. And I recently had a paper that came out about this that talked about this. I think, based off my research, there are 7 things that a land force must do in land warfare. Now, they don't have to do them all the time everywhere, but there's 7 inherent challenges that you're going to find no matter what you're doing in a land war that a land force must be capable of doing, that joint firepower, right? Air forces or whatever, cyber forces that are shooting little like weird cyber radar beams at you or whatever the case may be, or naval forces operating from off the coast, whatever the case may be. All those things help land forces in land wars. They don't actually win the war themselves, and land forces are the key thing that accomplish the things that have to be done to win those wars. And so, real fast, just on some of those the 7 things that I think that a military, an army has to do, a land force has to do, is they have to be capable of taking or retaking territory. And critical to that is being able to address the enemy combatant force that's on that territory. And so one of the comments that I got back on this paper that came out the other day was specifically, it didn't talk enough about kicking ass, and it only talked about terrain. And to me, it was implied when you're talking about taking and retaking terrain, you're talking about a hostile force being on that terrain. Thus, you have to be able to go in and do the things you have to do when you take or retake terrain, which means swiftly and decisively dealing with that hostile force. So I just want to pull that out real quick as I mentioned that one. Second is, you've got to be capable of clearing armies from a specific territorial holding. So that means you have to physically go in like an urban. This is linked to the urban idea, urban warfare. You have to physically go in and remove forces from that piece of territory, because a lot of times they'll seek refuge in terrain that offsets your strength, right? In many cases, everybody's strength, any military strength, is offset in urban terrain. You also have to have land forces that are capable of holding territory. So again, that means fighting back a hostile force. So if you want to think of it in defensive terms, that idea there of holding territory is defensive. Now, when we do that, though, at the same time, land forces must not culminate when taking or retaking territory, so that they're not prone to counterattack after they've taken it. So they have to be able to hold that territory, and that's what we mean there. And then at the same time, you can't fritter away your combat power, taking or retaking that territory or clearing the territory. You have to be able to hold it, because an enemy is likely going to counterattack. And if you go back and look at, I know we're quickly approaching 100 years, which is wild to me. 100 years from the Second World War. But if you go back and look at a lot of the doctrine that dominated back then, specifically German military thinking, counterattack was the first thing you did after somebody, had a modicum of success against you in the attack. And so those days may be coming back if we see land wars amongst states and, coming back to the fore. I don't know that we are, but if we are, that's something we need to consider. Uh, Also, land forces must be capable of protecting populations. That's critical, in any conflict, not just. And these points here are tied specifically to like land wars and what we would classify as conventional sense. But at the same time, there's this idea of protecting populations exists both there, but then also, as we've seen for the past 25, 30 years, also in insurgency, counterinsurgency, in counterterrorism situations also. So there's that. And then the last two I think are that we have to have, or the last three really, and they're all related, but we have to have armies or land forces that are capable of encircling hostile forces and then also holding hostile forces or fixing them in place. And that's really the mechanism that helps the land force bring in the joint force. So when we talk about joint capabilities, right, we talk about air forces and all the other services that can come in and help land forces accomplish their mission. That's really how land forces can unlock that or that mechanism of joint capability is through the encirclement of hostile forces with a holding or fixing of a hostile force in place. And then the last one is that armies must be capable of sealing boundaries. Because if they can't seal boundaries, whether that's an international boundary or a territorial boundary of some sort, or a boundary like in the case of Russia, Ukraine, the line of demarcation there, where the front is developed. Like if Ukraine can't seal that boundary, then they're going to have even more problems because Russia's going to do the incremental movement forward. And so I think that's the last point that I think is vitally important when we think about land warfare and land and how land forces have to operate. The defining characteristics there. So that was it on that. I know that was a little long. Ask me the second part of that again, or if I talk too long on that one, feel free to jump to your next question.
How do you see the technological advancements? And thank you for this
Mm.
wonderful insights. How do you see all of this characteristic vis-a-vis the technological advancements in the domain?
Yeah, so technological advancement, I think, is really important, not from the same area I think that perhaps other people view it from. Technology in the land domain, again, so everything should, in my opinion, my personal opinion, bound in all the research that I've done on the subject, suggests that those seven features or characteristics of land warfare, requirements of warfare, those are going to exist essentially as long as land wars are fought. And land wars are any war in which competing armies or competing land forces are opposed to one another on the land, and territory is up for grabs, right? Because essentially, if there's an army on the ground fighting for something, its territory is part of what it's fighting for, and therefore you have to remove that hostile force from that piece of territory and then situate yourself in the territory that's up for debate in such a way that they can't take it back, whoever the they may be in that situation. And so I say that to say that technology, in my opinion, should exist to help drive those seven challenges of land warfare, help land forces effectively accomplish those seven things. And so, again, I once worked for a boss that said something to the effect of, "You shouldn't lead with your face," meaning like you shouldn't have your most vulnerable things forward. And so, as we look to the future, I think there's unique space for robotics and autonomous, systems and AI enabled machinery to help us not lead whoever us is, right? Pick your us in this situation, not lead with our face, right? And so um, technology can help offset that, right? So it'll allow us to put a robot face forward, if you will. And when I say robot, I'm being a bit tongue in cheek. That can be whatever kind of non-human system we want, or at the same time too, I think human machine integrated formations will also be something. And I know that in itself is not anything new. Neither is what the leading with robots. But I think that it's important to just remember that those seven land warfare challenges that I mentioned, that is where robotics and technological innovation will help shape the future. And I also think too, so transparent battlefields being this idea that's being talked about as we move forward in time and space, something that'll be more prevalent. And so I think that technology can really help offset a lot of that too, when we think about information and the role that information will play on this future battlefield. And hell, I mean, it could be tomorrow or it could be 20 years from now, but information's still the germane piece to everything essentially. And as we move forward and try and integrate technology into the future, we need to be thinking about how we can manipulate information. And I don't mean like traditional, information operations, psychological operations type information operations. I mean like tactical and operational exploitation of data, you know, to mess with sensors that are on the battlefield, because there's going to be passive and active sensors. There's going to be remote viewing sensors. There's going to be sensors that are moving forward, probably perhaps as part of this robot formation that we've, alluded to. And so as, those things increased on the battlefield, we're going to have to increase ways of thinking about how to offset and overcome information collection challenges posed to us, whoever the us is in that situation. And so that, I think, is really one of the keys is um, technology will have an extremely important role in that aspect. And, you know, there's certain things that we can do when we think about that. You can corrupt data, you can poison data, you can make data intentionally, you can withhold data as best you can to confuse enemy decision making. At the same time, too, you can also uh, try and overflow information, right? Overflow data and present more information than what a potential adversary is capable of ingesting and then making sense of and then doing something with, right? And so there's those aspects. And so I think that moving forward, when we think about how to integrate technology and how technology will help land forces, that'll be really one of those areas. Because as we look to replace, the other thing too is forces look to replace traditional reconnaissance uh, elements in land forces and integrate other means of reconnaissance, so aerial reconnaissance and whatnot. It's going to become actually a bit, it become, that helps the reconnaissance to a degree, because you can arguably see bigger, wider, better. But at the same time, that by not physically having something on the ground that can look at something and interrogate it in a much more close range, physically touch almost type situation, the ability to take advantage of information and present bad information or misleading information is going to increase. And so I think that moving forward, really, when we think about technology and how technology is going to influence land warfare, that manipulation of information and data, that's different. It's a nuanced difference, right? But it's different than what we're currently thinking about when we think about data and information on the battlefield. And so I think that's really um, one of the other big takeaways I would have on how technology will affect land warfare in the future.
So those are some very key aspects of land or warfare. Thank you for the key insights, sir.
Hmm.
You talked about you know taking and retaking, grabbing and regrabbing the land. Uh, let's talk about Russia-Ukraine. On the second anniversary of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you've written a paper on a subject titled "The Russia-Ukraine War: A Strategic Assessment." 2 years into the conflict, in which using and ways, means, and risk heuristics, you provided sobering assessment of the conflict in the Eastern Europe. Under the present conditions, how do you see the end of the conflict in the Ukraine in terms of military gains and losses?
So again, I just want to make it clear that I'm speaking purely for myself when I say this. And I also want to say that I am 100% for Ukraine regaining all of its territory and, ending the conflict on terms best suited for them and their long-term, their long-term health and well-being. But it goes back to what we just talked about here, right? The Ukrainian land forces, as they currently are configured and exist, don't possess sufficient combat power, sufficient numbers to do these things, these 7 requirements of land forces to retake the territory that Russia's taken from them. And again, the other day, a few days ago, an aid package from the U.S. was finally approved, and aid from the U.S. military aid has started flowing in again, after several months of not having that. And so that'll help. But the problem that I think most people forget, and this is one of the points I tried to make in that paper, and then I had a subsequent podcast of my own on my own podcast where I talked about this, is that again, the thing that I've been banging away on with all that is it takes a land force to defeat a land force, and that's why these 7 elements are critical to understand. And so all the aid, not all the aid, lots of the aid that has been provided is focused on firepower that's delivered through the air, and not firepower or land, like physical land forces, right? You can't give somebody more soldiers. And you know, I mean, you can, but they're your own soldiers, in which case, like, then that's a whole different problem. And so, like, the Ukrainians, really what they need is more infantrymen, more tankers. I don't know what everybody else calls them, but in the U.S. we call tank crewmen tankers. But you need more tankers, you need more infantrymen, you need more artillery and artillerymen to go do the physical, slug it out fighting to take and retake that territory and hold that territory. And so I also, again, I've used this analogy several times, but the game of Risk, I think, is instructive when we think about this. When you play Risk, you have to, if you're trying to take territory where 2 forces are converged on the game board, you have to attack from the territory you're in to the next territory. If you win that fight, you have to subsequently move forces into the territory that you just defeated the army in, move forces in, but you also have to leave at least, you know, 1 army in the force or in the territory you attacked from. And then the balance of what moves forward versus what stays back depends on each player's strategy and what it is they're trying to accomplish in the game. And in Ukraine's position in Russia, you know, they've got to do that. They've got to attack from the territory that they currently hold, defeat a Russian land force that's been digging in now for, you know, at this point, I would say probably a year to a year and a half, perhaps, physically digging into the line and establishing like a quasi permanent foothold there on that front line. And then you have to go in there, clear that force out, and physically cause, you either physically kill your way through that thing, or you've inflicted sufficient damage on that force that either the military says, you know, the losses are too high and this is too much, and we're just going to go ahead and go and pull out, or you've done the same thing at that level to the point that it's hit the political level, and somebody at the MOD in Moscow, or, you know, Putin, potentially says, hey, it's time to pull the plug on this, let's go ahead and just back out. The odds of that end of the spectrum are very low. You're far more likely to cause, you know, military leaders on the ground and formations to flee. But at the same time, it's important to understand too some dynamics that are at work here. And I talk about this in the most recent paper I keep referring to. Sorry, the principles of war, or the principles for the future of warfare and standoff warfare. And so in that paper, standoff warfare is another idea that I address here too. And so we've replaced the big we, the royal we here. We've replaced this idea that we have to go in and do these 7 land warfare challenges and be able to do them right, clear the territory, retake territory, hold territory, encircle formations, and hold formations in place and seal boundaries. A lot of that thinking and acceptance, because I think those are truisms. Those aren't just things that, you know, Amos made up one day. Those are things that are like empirically supported with historical evidence, to to include evidence today. If you can't do that, you're not going to be able to do anything. It's a standoff warfare. This idea that, you know, drones and precision strike and things like attackums and all this are just going to be able to magically make all those things that affect of those 7 land force challenges actually come about. And so the point of all that is this focus on providing all this firepower that enables standoff warfare to the Ukrainians is good and well. Like, I fully think that that's a terrific idea, but without sufficient redundant and resilient land forces, right? Infantry, armor, artillery, things that can physically, and engineers again, because you're going to have to do this, massive clearances of minefields and who knows whatever else is going to be out in this area that the Russians have been defending. Without the sufficient land force to go in and address those land warfare challenges, I don't see Ukraine being capable of retaking the territory. And so, what I think, based off my own assessment, is that Russia will try and keep nibbling away at taking pieces of territory along the front. Um, if something, if an opportunity somehow presents itself where like a Ukrainian front starts to collapse, they may try and do some bigger land grab. But I think the big land grabs, at least right now, are over. I don't think that Russia necessarily is interested at this point, given the current situation, in trying to take any kind of big piece of territory again, right? So like taking Kharkiv or something, for instance. Like now, that's, I wouldn't rule that out, but given the current situation, that's where I think Russia's basically focused is on that. They've got their what I've deemed their minimally acceptable outcome, right? They have the Donbass, the land bridge of Crimea, and then Crimea. I think big picture, they being probably what's going on in Putin's mind itself. They are happy to hold that territory, and if they lose, if the war ends today and Russia's holding that territory, Russia's happy, Russia's fine. They've gotten, minimally speaking, the policy objectives that they were looking for, right? Because they've finally linked up the Donbass and the land bridge, which is what they had tried, or the Donbass with Crimea, which is what they had tried to do in 2014 and 2015, but we're not able to do that. So on that side, I think it's good. So they're happy to sit and hold the line, is my point. But Ukraine, I don't think, has the sufficient land force, to go in and do the things to remove the Russian forces, nor generate the cognitive effect on the Russian forces and or the Russian military political decision makers at the strategic level, to generate a, hey guys, we're going to go ahead and withdraw, retreat, right? And so a long way of saying, I don't think that Ukraine, they may win the war in that they've retained their statehood, and they remain, the existing political, economic, and domestic system remains in place. But I don't think that they win the war without regaining that territory. I don't think that they possess the requisite land forces to go in and do that, and firepower. You know, all these missiles and all the standoff warfare type capabilities that Western states and others are giving them, I don't think is sufficient to help generate the effect on the land that is required for Ukrainian land forces to thus come in and retake the land itself.
So my next question is in that direction only. You mentioned about, the all the efforts are not sufficient in the right direction. You also mentioned in the same paper about the strategy of exhaustion. Uh,
Mm.
how how do you think the West, in general, and Ukraine, but in particular, can counter this strategy of exhaustion? Because you also mentioned that Russia is quite winning by even keeping itself in that area. How do you think West should counter that?
So this is it's almost um, a philosophical question, and a question of, I would say it's almost a philosophical question, but then in its practical sense, it's a question we're already too late on, because to embrace the idea of exhaustion as the path to victory. You can't almost do that in stride during a conflict. That has to be something that your political, economic, military system, as it's interrelated with one another, is already built upon before you enter on a war, right? Because if not, you quickly find yourself exhausted in terms of the things that are required, right? Whether it's munitions or clothing and bullets and other stuff, And so if you haven't done that on the before conflict started, so if that's not how you automatically just think about war, as we're going to outlast you materially for as long as it takes, then you arguably aren't going to be able to probably change to that in conflict, because you're always going to be trying to play catch up instead of ever actually having the desired depth beforehand that allows you to uh, address shock. Like something catastrophic happened here, so you have to reallocate stuff from here to there. Um, and so doing that without having that depth of material built up beforehand causes significant shortages as you look to fill the hole in what's going on, right? And so that's why I say it's almost it's a mindset, it's a belief about how wars are won and fought that has to be fundamental to what it is a state does or doesn't do before they even enter into a conflict. Because again, if not, you're always going to be playing catch up. And so that's, I think, the important thing there to remember. And then with that, we have to understand that the fancy idea, and this is where I think there's some bad thinking as it pertains to the role of uh, precision strike and ideas like standoff warfare, right? The the thing that was borne out, I think, is the as we've continued to pursue this idea of precision, and precision becoming central to what it is, Western militaries specifically are really trying to do as it relates to the application of combat power. But the problem with precision is the idea has become like we can cut the head off things, and then the body will flail around until it dies. But that's not how, like, in my mind I was thinking of a chicken, right? You cut the head off a chicken, it flops around until it falls over and dies. But that's not how militaries work, right? Because that that closed system thinking of cut the head off, the thing dies. It's not reality. The reality is, like, and again, another paper that I published not too long ago, it was essentially, there was a part in there that said that the focus on cutting the head off or attacking command nodes and attacking senior leadership, like that, I think is almost mirror imaging of what Western states think about themselves, right? They think, oh, we've got the best leaders and our guys would just kind of quit working if I wasn't here showing them the way to do things, right? And so we've got that, but then this idea that cutting the head off is going to actually do anything. Again, that's understanding a system incorrectly and viewing it accidentally as a closed system as opposed to an open dynamic system, which I think all militaries really are. And so systems theory, to me, systems thinking is critical to understanding the idea of exhaustion. And this is why I think exhaustion is vitally important to um, fighting and winning wars, right? So when we think about, if we understand systems theory, if a part of the system's dying, you're not going to reinforce failure there. You're going to say, all right, well, now we have to reallocate things so that dying part of the system doesn't cause the entire system to die, right? And so because of that, you'll reallocate how the system operates. And it's the same thing when I said talking about land forces and targeting headquarters, right? When we think about exhaustion, targeting command, first off, hasn't been proven as a way to win war. I just want to say that that's this theoretical idea that sounds good in papers. I've got John Warden's Five Rings Theory paper over in my corner here. It sounds good in journals, but and realistically it doesn't work. And so what does work is you have to, like, target land forces. You have to target the things that actually go do the fighting, right? Command nodes and commanders don't go do fighting, especially as you move up in echelons, right? Maybe at the micro level, at the platoon or company battalion level, you have that. But as you move up beyond that, like, you can play whack-a-mole with general officers all day long, and it doesn't really make a big difference on how the war goes or doesn't go. And so, uh, but you can go out and you can kill their command post too, right? You can wipe it off the map in a strike or two. But guess what? their army, their force is still going to go out and do what it's supposed to do, because it isn't a closed system that just dies on the vine when the head's been chopped off. Junior leaders step up and say, "Hey, the boss is now gone. I'm now the boss. Let's go, guys. Let's go accomplish the mission." Right? And so the belief in mission outweighs the what's the word here, outweighs the power of the commander. And so I think that that also, when you think about systems thinking and systems theory and how systems theory applies to military operations, that idea is critical, because a commander in the field without an army is just a dude standing in a field without an army, whereas a force in the field without a commander is still a force that can go do all the things it's supposed to do. And so that's where I think the idea of exhaustion also comes into play. So you can think about cutting the head off of whatever enemy system it is all day long. You think about, destroying command posts and command nodes, and that's great. But I would argue that that's just a fanciful way of thinking about generating victory. We have to understand that systems are dynamic and complex, and there are hidden dynamics that we may not necessarily see at play, right? So this is another thing where Russia, I think, has shown this idea. If we go back to Robert Dahl's paper, The Concept of Power, that was published in like the 1950s, and it's like one of the foundational documents on how we should think about the application of power. One of the key elements there that he talks about when he talks about power is bases of power. And there's the known bases of power that you can see beforehand, that you can look at and be like, oh, okay, I understand what they have and what they don't have. But this is why correlation of forces and means only gets you so far when you look at analysis on the front end of a conflict, and you have to understand what other connections there may or may not be, right? And so, like, we look at Russia and we're like, hey, look, they've inflicted all these losses, but we didn't necessarily think about all the elements of additional bases of power that they had, and were able to call on and activate, which allowed them to continue the conflict, right? And so these things are, again, why I think that exhaustion is critical to understand. And so that's one of the things that I don't know how familiar your listeners are. I mean, I can tell you, when I talk to people, not many people are familiar with it anyway, but systems theory, systems thinking is foundational to this, and it's really important to help oneself understand, like, when somebody like me says, hey, exhaustion is critical to this. Systems theory is important, and Donella Meadows' book Systems Thinking, a Primer, for me was like it is still one of the foundational documents. And if you look at many things that I write when I'm actually talking about these ideas, like, her book is almost always referenced, because the ideas in there are so apropos to what it is militarily, that it happens because of this dynamic, complex, open system of competing complex, dynamic, and open systems being fighting against one another, right? And so that's really why I think it's, exhaustion is something so important to understanding, because that's how you killing a headquarters and killing a commander, and then that army, or, I'm using army again, air quotes here, that force, whatever it is, throwing up their hands and saying, oh, you beat me. It takes exhaustion. It takes the continual pounding of a hostile force, and grinding through the things that they have, because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's going to get the policymaker to say, hey, we can't keep fighting, right? If the big military leader comes to the policymaker and says, hey, sir, guess what, we physically do not possess the means any longer, the material things, to keep fighting, then that's going to cause the policymaker to say we quit. If you go to that guy, the same guy, and say, hey, big boss, like, we just had like a bunch of generals killed, he's going to be like, well, promote the colonels, right? And keep going. And so I think that in itself is, that little dynamic there is important, understanding that.
Quite sobering and realistic assessment of the situation.
Yep.
And now you also mentioned about firepower. Then I recall your podcast with Professor Jeremy Black on tank warfare and firepower. How do you see the role of firepower in modern warfare? And I'm not just talking about tank, I'm talking about firepower in general when we talk about air power combining with
Yeah.
firepower.
Yeah. So I think that it's critical. I think that possessing sufficient forces, and one of the critiques that continually seems to be popping up today is, like, is the tank dead? And that was one of the cool conversations with Jeremy Black that we got to have, and some other guests that I've had on my podcast is talking about that. And the critical thing that I think folks forget when they make that argument is, um, it requires everything, because combined arms theory, nerds like me still say combined arms theory when they talk about war and warfare, but it's really like it's applied theory, and it's important because without the different elements of firepower, that you can bring to bear, then you're making yourself prone to other elements of combined arms, right? That you wouldn't otherwise be prone to. And so, again, I'm going to use this example to then get at your question more holistically. But when we talk about the tank is dead, right? And people are like, oh, look, drones are killing all these tanks. It's not that the tank is dead. Part of it is going back to the very first thing we talked about, land and geography, right? If you're stuck in a place where certain elements of combat power, like a tank, isn't useful, or infantry are in the open, right? And there's nowhere for them to go except way far away that exceeds their ability to move quickly to that. Um, then certain things are going to appear to somebody that's uneducated in combined arms or situational dynamics that something may no longer be useful, right? And so then you can make the argument, oh, we need to get rid of this because we don't need this any longer because drones have replaced the need for that, but the other part of that that's not being looked at is, okay, so what really is going on the land is they don't have sufficient capability to counter the drone yet, right? And so when we talk about combined arms theory and firepower, drones can be defeated fairly easily with requisite technology, right? The requisite firepower. That may be cyber firepower. It may be laser firepower. I don't know. That's a stretch a bit on like the use of the word firepower, because usually when we think about firepower, we think about something that flies from a gun of some sort and blows up, right? But cyber focused cyber thingies, I don't know, I'm not a cyber guy, that fries keyboards and motherboards and whatever other kind of boards electronics have. Like that's something that's firepower in its own sense. The same thing too with like I said, like directed energy type stuff, right? And so if a force possesses sufficient firepower to counter the drone, then the drone is irrelevant, or not irrelevant, but less relevant than it would otherwise be, than what we think it is when we see that. And so it's not that things like tanks or armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles are irrelevant. It's that whatever that thing is that you saw, they didn't possess sufficient combined arms, sufficient capabilities that could attack and kill those drones that allowed the tanks to do what tanks have to do, right? And then also going back to the geography piece, the on a static front, anything sitting out in the open is vulnerable to anything that's flying overhead, right? And so to say that something like, tanks or dismounted infantry or this or that sitting on the ground is no longer relevant because drones have now obviated their battlefield effectiveness. Well, look at the situation. Like the line's not moving. And that goes back to the Ukrainians don't possess sufficient land forces to do any kind of significant push to get through the Russian lines to try and, encircle the Russian forces and wipe them off Ukrainian territory. And so that I think is critical to appreciate when we think about firepower. And so I say all that to say that I think firepower on the battlefield will remain a critical thing as we move forward. There will be a lot of things that technology can do that we wouldn't be able to do today. But big picture, again, I don't see armies throwing up their hands and quitting without the mass death and destruction of their peers and colleagues around them. I think again at the end of the day, that's the path to victory. It's not um, some other sort of mechanism. Again, in my head, it's always this like I don't know if the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats resonates at all with the people that are listening, but like that was a movie about how, you know, the army had developed this force, this exploratory battalion that used like mental processes to cause things to quit fighting or to die, right? And so in that, they stare at these goats, and then the goat would like fall over dead, you know. And so anyway, like I don't think we can men who stare our goats ourselves to victory. We have to think still that firepower is going to be the way that we do it, and firepower targeting forces, land forces, specifically.
Quite interesting, sir. Uh, I know you're currently also a chief human resource officer at the Irregular Warfare Initiative. And irregular
Mm-hmm.
warfare roughly can be defined as a struggle between state and non-state actors. In the present context, one of the biggest examples of this would be Israel's war against Hamas, a non-state terrorist organization. Amid the current circumstances, what are the ways to curb the threats of non-state actors across the globe, especially in the Middle East right now?
I think if and I don't I say this with all due respect, I think if we knew the answers to that one, we wouldn't continue to have all the problems we have with non-state actors. Especially in the Middle East, as somebody that's been, I spent 3 years of my life in Iraq addressing similar, problems or problems related to non-state actors. It's just something you can't really put your thumb on, right? And that's one of the things when we look back at Iraq in 2011, when the insurgency developed in Iraq after the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime, it was very much a concerted effort to try and understand, hey, non-state actors, what are the problems we're dealing with here, and how can we address those problems in a way that's beneficial to both sides, right? Because at the end of the day, non-state actors often materialize from the result of not having their needs met, whatever their needs may be. Now, sometimes there's some cases where some non-state actors are just completely radical people, and you can't necessarily worry about what they want, because what they want's so fringe that it doesn't align with the norms and values of society. And so I think that that's really the critical aspect. Is the generic answer really is trying to address the problems of instability and insecurity that are causing non-state actors to metastasize into some sort of organized um, group, right? But short of that, and again, that's there are factions within non-state actors, right, that have their own thing, and sometimes it's like when we look at some of the militia groups that fought the U.S. in Iraq, a lot of it was they had distinct, um, their own distinct ideas on what they wanted, but the fact that the U.S. was there and they all hated the U.S. was reason for them to work together. And so I think that that's just something too that it's important to understand when we think about non-state actors and how to address them. Is sometimes it may seem simple, like, oh, what's bothering them, let's figure that out and let's go take care of that, but beneath the surface that may actually be a fairly complicated thing. And so I say all that to give you that answer, but I know it's not a very good answer. And again, the non-state actor thing, I think, really is one of the um, key things that has caused warfare to be so challenging for forever, right? That is the germinating seed um, that basically topples regimes and governments and everything. And so I think that'll just be a problem that we continue to have to deal with suboptimally. We being just whomever, um, till the end of time. Like I don't, there's
The
not
doc-
really a good way to address that challenge.
no, we can say that the doctrinal aspects of it is in work in progress.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. As we come to the end of this conversation, I would like to ask you a final question.
Yeah.
We in Geostrata and in India, we work on multiple domains. We have
Mm.
young people across the India and some are from across the globe who are very much interested in doing research in geopolitics, strategy, and warfare. What advice will you give to our young audiences who's also interested in build a career in these domains?
Yeah, I would say that the first thing is don't. I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. Don't accept the status quo ideas, the conventional wisdom, as the like key elements of understanding, right? Because these ideas are generally like the things that are being said, the ideas that are being taught are often the ideas that are guiding the people that are making all the decisions that are causing all the problems that we're dealing with, right? So I say that to say, like, be bold to think differently and explore things from a different lens, but also be prepared for that to potentially come back and be problematic for you, right? Because a lot of places, a lot of people don't like views that are counter or contrarian to what it is they think or they say, right? And if you're going in challenging long-standing ideas, like I just did um, my PhD defense yesterday, and one of the aspects that was surprising to me that they brought up when I was doing my defense was, in like small tangential to the whole big thing, right? I had mentioned how centers of gravity are less relevant today than they've ever been, and I would argue they're not relevant. I do argue they're not relevant at all. And that was like a passing comment in this, 277-page document. And that was one of the things that the one of my examiners honed in on and like wanted an answer about, and he was like, "Tell me about this and why you think this." And I was like, it was just fascinating because it's to me like that to me, and that in that context, it represented such a like minuscule point, but it was not attacking, but deconstructing, because the argument itself, I lay out the logic for why I say this. I don't just say it and move on. I spent a couple pages actually out of this whole thing explaining why that wasn't relevant. And but it's one of these sacred cows that people hold supreme. So like if you're going to go in and challenge the orthodoxy of Clausewitz, just be ready for the Clausewitzians to come down on you really hard. And it's like that with any idea, and I just use Clausewitz as a general a general idea that, or a general person and general set of thinking there. So that would be my main thing, is don't be afraid to challenge the Clausewitzians, if you will, but also to just be prepared for them to come down on you pretty hard when they find offense with what you say, regardless of how logically and empirically supported what you say may be. Institutions are going to institution, and bureaucracies exist in many cases to perpetuate the bureaucracy. And so, if you come injecting ideas into a bureaucracy that are counter to the origin myths and all the perpetuating myths of a bureaucracy, just know that that's something. But at the same time, to deal with challenges of the future, which every day, every tomorrow is another future. So I don't, when I say future, I don't even mean like 30 years from now. I mean like 2 weeks from now. We have to be doing that, right? Because um, in many cases, not in many cases, in every case, those bureaucracies are what create the problems of today and the problems of tomorrow. And by virtue of that, the next logical step is they're going to be, because of their own indoctrination, their own education, their own ways of doing things are going to be insufficient to addressing those challenges. So we need people that are thinking about things differently to even if it's an inkling, right, of something that can be unlocked, as opposed to just continually running into the same problem day after day. That's what I would urge people to do, is just keep thinking, reading, and questioning things, and don't take the status quo as the way things always should be and always will be. We need people that are challenging ideas, and challenging ideas also means the other thing with all that is, so you don't need to be the person that just sits there and in a conference throws a stink bomb in the room and says, yeah, but what about this, right? You need to be the person that's writing and introducing new ideas, right? Because new ideas just verbalized in in a room like that goes very little. That has very little. It's like a gas. As soon as the door opens, that idea evaporates. And so you need concrete ideas about how to address challenges of today for the future, and that has to be addressed through writing. And so I think that writing is vitally important, and not being afraid to be wrong or to change one's opinion, right? And so it's okay to be wrong, you know what I mean? Like, that's fine. And that's where I think we have a lot of problem, is folks that are so reluctant to be wrong or to be criticized. Because trust me, like, I've published a ton of stuff, and I've written, and I've got the podcast and done all sorts of stuff. Like, you get criticized by people, and like, you just have to be able to deal with that. Does it sometimes like get to you? For sure. You're like, man, all this good work that I thought was great, and these whomever thinks it's trash. Yeah, sometimes it does weigh on you, but at the same time, like, people need to keep pushing forward to try and advance the way that we're thinking. Because again, I'm going to use Clausewitz one last time here. Sitting here referencing a book that was written 250 years ago to address the problems of today and the problems of tomorrow. Like, sure, there are some enduring ideas that are useful there, but the vast majority of that, Clausewitz in this instance, is no longer relevant or useful. And so we have to have new Clausewitzes, wherever they may come from, working, doing their best to come up with the new ways of thinking to address future problems. And so that's, again, I know, sorry, went long on that answer too, but I think you're actually asking questions that I care a lot about, and so that's why you're getting these long answers. But that's my answer to your question on that.
Thank you very much, sir. It was very enriching. Thank you for the advice, and the whole conversation was very enriching. And it was, again, a very great honor for us to have you here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, hey, I appreciate it a ton. Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. It's been fun talking with you.